Start with my mother. She was born in Missouri, and my grandfather was a doctor in those days. The doctors in those days were still in horse and buggies. The only painkillers he had was probably alcohol and opium. And he carried splints, he carried glasses, he was everything as far as the area was concerned there. Anyway, he died of pneumonia when he was 39, so my grandmother remarried. And they moved to Doyle, California, which is about 30 or 40 miles on Highway 395 north of Reno, Nevada. And then my mother grew up there with her sister, Edna, and their name was Bullock. And they got a job when they were early working as telephone operators, and she met my father, however, in Reno. And my father came from Germany when he was 8 years old. They were actually from East Germany. They were in Stettin. And some people have said our name is Latvian rather than German. However, my grandfather had a pretty good job in the German army, and they got on the wrong side of the war, and so he had to send my grandmother and my father to California or to the United States, and then he came a little bit later. They moved to Sacramento, and my aunt married my uncle Raymond C. Oakley in the early 20s. My brother was born 6.5 years before me, and I was born on December the 29th, 1924. My mother and father didn't get along at all, and she claimed he was an alcoholic, a terrible man, and so forth. And I found out later, however, he had shingles, and probably it was one of the few ways he could get some relief from the pains of the shingles. My mother and father were divorced, and my uncle and aunt fortunately didn't have any children, and they took my mother and my brother and I into their home during the Depression. I just didn't see my father. It isn't like it is for the divorces today, where the children get battled back and forth. I saw my father once, and I think they snuck me out to see him at a ranch one time. And the next time I saw him, he was in his coffin when I was in the 8th grade. And so I really didn't have too much to do with my father. My uncle, who became my father, was really quite an interesting family, because his father was born on the corner of 10th and O and 10th in Sacramento in 1851. My uncle, of course, grew up in Sacramento, went to school in Sacramento, and graduated from high school. His family was pretty poor, and he became something of a gambler when he was young in high school, because he used to win his lunches by playing handball. I said, "What if you lost, sir? You didn't have any money." He said, "I didn't lose. I learned to pick the right opponents." As he grew up, he went into World War I and became a battalion sergeant major, and then spent 7 months at the cost of the French government in University d'Aix-Marseille, I believe it was, and they had a great time after World War I. He spent a short period of time in World War I, and of course, you know, to listen to what they did in those times as far as the war was concerned, it was worth 30 men's lives to take out a machine gun nest and that sort of thing. It was really quite difficult. After that, he came home and went to work for the city of Sacramento. He was a clerk at first, and rapidly worked up to assistant city manager. And when they put the city manager system in 1923, before I was born, where they made him the first assistant city manager that they had, and he went through 7 city managers, including Bartley Kavanaugh, who's one of the golf courses is named after now, and a number of other people. He was a reasonably prominent man in the city, and he taught me a great deal about ethics and a great deal about life. My mother owned a flat on 1225 Q Street in Sacramento. And so they rented the lower end of the flat, we lived in the upper end of the flat. But they owned a house at 2140 36th Street in Sacramento. And when they were there at in Sacramento on Q Street, why, I went to the 1st and 2nd grade in Jefferson School, which was over on 16th Street. One evening they were playing cards. He was a great bridge player. And they sent me across the street where there was a little grocery store. And the little grocery store that was across the street was sitting right here. And instead of going straight across the street when I came back, I went diagonally. A car came around the corner and hit me. I don't remember a thing. I woke up in the Sutter Hospital, and I've told all of my children and grandchildren, if that car would have been going 10 minutes faster, they wouldn't be here. Then we moved into my uncle's house on 2140 36th Street, and in those days, while we went through the school system, all the same kids went to school for that 10 years. Boy Scouts, normal things that we do. My mother was a telephone operator, and she didn't make very much money. We lived at their house. I'm not sure what they charged for living at the house, but he supported his father, his mother, my mother, my brother, and me to some extent, because my mother did work. My mother remarried in 1938, and when she remarried, they moved to Sonora, where I am not far from where I live now. And he was an accountant, and he worked for the Pickering Lumber Company. Then the rest of my life there was with my uncle and my aunt, until I went into the service. I went in March '43, and the first place I went to was, we went to the relocation centers. We went to Monterey, and then from Monterey we went to Basic Training Center number 8 in Fresno, California, which was at the old fairgrounds. And we got from 6 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, every minute was taken up when we were in basic training. You had no discussions or anything that you wanted to do yourself. Everything was all laid out for you. After that, they sent me to radio operator mechanic school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I was there for 20 weeks. And for the 20 weeks I was there, we got into the wintertime, I caught pneumonia. After that, I got out of the hospital. They sent me to control tower operator school in Madison, Wisconsin, which was 8 weeks. I caught pneumonia again. That time they put me in a private room. When a PFC is in a private room, you know he's pretty close to death. So I managed to survive that thing another time. After that, of course, since I was from California, where did they send me? They sent me to Greenland. And at Greenland, we were took care of the planes being ferried over to Europe. And that was in 43, 44. And we went out to Semi-Attack Island. It was at the mouth of the Tanugl-Yarfik Fjord. And where we were at that island, we could get straight radio communication with all of the flights that came over. Now remember, in those days, a medium bomber and many of the airplanes couldn't possibly fly across the Pacific. They went from Presque Isle, Maine, to Labrador, to Narsarsuaq, to Reykjavik, Iceland, and then to Edinburgh, Scotland. When we were busy, we were very busy. They had flights that were going on that were all the time. When we were doing in the wintertime, I would sit there for 6 hours in my door and say, right, no traffic. We had no days off when we were there at the island. Late in the May of that year, while I was up at my Raycon radar shaft, my first contact with the enemy was when I looked over one morning when I came up. It was May, and of course the days were pretty long in those days, and I looked up and there was a German submarine off the side of the island. And in the German submarine that was off to the side of the island, I could see a guy at the conning tower, so I went in and got the field glasses, and I looked over there, and sure enough, and he didn't see me right at first. Then all of a sudden, I could tell he saw me, and as soon as he did, a bunch of guys came out. Now we had 26 men on the island. They usually have 60 men on the submarine. We had instructions in case we were invaded to destroy the equipment and save ourselves. We had 230 caliber machine guns, 250 caliber machine guns, and each of us had a carbine. And we'd never had a moment of combat amongst the group of us. So at any rate, they had the guys come out and they put the cannons over there. But this was in March, and the war was just about over, and obviously they knew that. So at any rate, I told the air-to-ground people about what was happening, so they came out, and sure enough, they could see it. So they called the main base, which was 58 miles up the fjord. Narsarsuaq, Buoy West 1 is what they called it then. And we told them we had an enemy submarine off the island, and they didn't believe us, and then we told them again, and then they decided to believe us. And we said, send bombers and go after these guys. And so they were on voice communication by then. We used to do a lot of it in CW code, but they were getting the information back and forth as fast as they could. And we were surprised to hear that they said, we got bombers here, but we don't have any bombs. So they called Labrador, 726 miles away, and in Goose Bay, and they sent over the airplanes, and they came over about 3.5 or 4 hours later. By that time, the submarine was long gone. My combat with the enemy. After I got out of the service and came back, I just knocked around. I spent most of my time at home. Met my wife, and we got married in March of '46. I met my wife through my best friend when I was on a furlough after I'd gone through basic training. Why, I'd met her briefly then. When I came home, I was in Presque Isle, and they had a CDY. I went to Wichita Falls, and then they got a 40-day temporary duty. To make a long story short, the last 5 months I was in the service, I spent 4 of them at home, and the rest of the time I was just knocking around. At any rate, I met my wife, and she was quite young, and so was I. And we got married, went to Reno, Nevada. She went to the Catholic schools, and her family wasn't too happy about it when they found out we were married. She was really worried about her grandmother because her grandmother was always kind of strict with her. They called her Biddy. Her name was Elizabeth R. Hamilton. And she was really worried about the time when I would meet her. When Biddy and I met, it was she was the greatest gal I ever saw. She and I got along wonderfully till the day she died. Her father was Linus Cassidy, and he was born in Berkeley, California, and his parents were the Cassidys, he worked for Standard Oil. And he did extremely well for them. He handled the historical standpoint for Standard Oil. Her father died, Linus Cassidy, when she was about 2 or 3, and her mother remarried James Kearns, and then they had 2 more children. So my wife had 2 half-brothers and sisters. Her life with James Kearns and the other thing was not a particularly happy one. But the important part of their family was the fact that her mother's father was Guy Clarence Hamilton. Guy Clarence Hamilton was vice president and general manager of the Sacramento Bee. And he really had some colorful stories, and he passed away in 1950. So I had a chance for 2 or 3 years to talk to him. The last years of his life, he had half of his body they didn't have the proper circulation. And because of that, when you would be talking to him, he would be rubbing his legs and rubbing his arms. Well, he went to work for the Sacramento Bee in 1911 or 1912. He got into a tiff with them, and then he wanted to start the radio stations. They didn't like it too well, the McClatchys didn't, but he talked them into it and going into business with the Kimball Upson Company, which was like Macy's or a department store. And they didn't think there was going to be anything with this newfangled radio business, and then they found out the radio business was pretty good. The interesting part was, after he had worked for quite a while, the 2 brothers were fighting with each other something fierce. Vince and CK just couldn't get along. So they called them down to the Bank of America at 8th and J, which is the main branch at that time, and Ham told me that they wanted a price at which they would buy or sell. And they finally settled on the price, but then they couldn't decide who would buy and who would sell. So they flipped a coin. If it had been tails, Ham would have been out of a job. As it was heads, and he was vice president and general manager of the Sacramento Bee. Within 3 years, he'd set up the Modesto Bee and the Fresno Bee, and in 1935 and 1936, he informed me he was the highest salaried man in the state of California. He made $5,000 a month during the Depression. And that was when the governor of the state of California made $15,000 a year. And then he went on we went back to East quite a bit. He knew James Farley, had a number of notes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because the Valley of the Bees was important as far as the politics was concerned in those days, as you can well imagine, and was very much involved with the country. To give you an idea of how he ran the Bee, in 1952 I had the occasion to go to Modesto and sit next to the guy that was the manager of the Modesto Bee. He said, "Did I know Mr. Hamilton?" He said, "I remember he called me on the phone one time to read me out," and he said, "For 35 minutes all I said was, 'Yes, Mr. Hamilton.'" They felt like he had everybody buffaloed. That was really the story. And one of the jobs that his wife really hated was that Carlos McClatchy was CK's son. Eleanor McClatchy was his daughter. And Carlos McClatchy was a down in the gutter drunk. He would go down to the lower end of Sacramento when the lower end of Sacramento was really the lower end, when you could find people laying on the sidewalk dead drunk. And when Carlos got into trouble, YCK would call Ham and wanted to keep it quiet, and he'd have to go down to the lower end and find out where he was and dig him out of the gutter. And boy, did he hate that part of the job. And when Seike passed away in 1938, Eleanor McClatchy inherited the Bee. So she came into the Sacramento Bee in Sacramento, naturally, and she started to make a few little changes. So he took her by the arm and walked her out in front, and he said, I set her out there and said, don't come back in here without my permission. She only owned the paper, and she didn't until 1943. And in 1943, he went back to Washington, D.C., and when he was back in Washington, D.C., he caught a cold and then pneumonia. They told him to go to bed. He went back and he went to work, and they hauled him out of the Sacramento Bee feet first, and he was not able to work for 3 or 4 months. They suddenly discovered the Sacramento Bee would work without him, and he never went back again. Well, now there's another thing that was interesting about his family, and that's the fact that he had 4 children. And it goes back to one of the things that I think about when you give your children too much. All of the children had they could have all the education they wanted to. His son Paul was an alcoholic who was the bootlegger for St. Mary's College. His oldest son Clarence failed in 2 businesses that he set him up in. His oldest daughter Helen became a nun, and they had to go back and buy her out of the nunnery 10 years later. Then Margaret was the youngest, and of course she married Linus, and their first child was Pat. But Ham was really a very, very colorful and a very interesting part of our history. But if you go to Sacramento today and you go down to the area and you're looking for the history of Sacramento, all of the things that Ham did, setting up the railroads, setting up the station, the various radio stations and the newspapers, were all credited to Carlos McClatchy, who never did a thing. My mother never really discussed it too much with my uncle did. And of course, he was my father, my mentor, and one of the persons I most respected in my entire life. And he said, don't forget, Robert, education is something no one can take away from you. And it was extremely important as far as he was concerned. He gave me my morals to a great extent. He really spoiled me to a great extent because of the affection he had for me. But when he laid down the law, he laid down the law. But he rarely ever laid down anything for me. His idea was, are we asking too much of you? Is this unreasonable? And he would reason with me, and usually his reasoning was right. And of course, I respected him so greatly that I wouldn't have defied him in most anything. I was not a great student. I got straight A's in history, but that was about the only subject. But I didn't have a chance to go to college myself. And I've never really regretted it, because I think going to college, unless you have a specific thing that you want to learn, if you want to be a doctor, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be an engineer, if you want to be something like that, and when you get out of college, you've got a skill, fine. But to go to college for 4 weeks for a general education, I've had some of my grandchildren do that, and one of them's a bartender. He can't get a job now. What's the advantage of it? I think for the cost of it, it's a waste of money unless you're going there for a specific purpose. Yeah, we have to have a lot of reverence for education. But I got my education through working for a company, working with a company. I felt like a 4-year education would have been not particularly valuable to me. First of all, now all of my children, 3 of the children all have college degrees, and my youngest son has a master's, and they've all got a good education. On the other case, however, my oldest daughter graduated from high school, never had a degree, but she married a Stanford PhD, and that gave her her education. At any rate, yes, education is extremely important if you're doing something, but as an overall thing, I would say if you're going into a trade or something like that, it's a waste of time. Primarily honesty with the fact that I wouldn't want a trusted friend who disagreed with me to agree with me just because we disagreed. In fact, some of my greatest friends, the guy that lived across the street from me in Moraga and my friend in high school, would criticize and debate with me about a number of things. I really felt like I learned a lot from someone not agreeing with me and being able to understand. For instance, when I had very good friend across the street from me when we lived in Moraga. This was during my business career. His name was Eddie Staub. And Eddie was a brigadier general in the Marine Corps. And we used to argue, and we'd get out there on Sundays, and instead of doing our work, we'd drink beer and argue with each other. Oh boy, we'd argue about everything. One of the things we argued about, which was interesting, when I was telling him about I own my house, he says, Robert, you don't own your house. The government owns your house. The government owns everything. What you own is a bundle of rights, and the state will help you protect those rights. You can't put a gas station on the front lawn. You can't put a 200-foot tower in the backyard. And so I finally discovered that, we really have to pay attention to government, because government is very much a part of our lives, which I'm sure you're well aware of. Did I ever find myself running with the wrong crowd? Yes, a couple of times. But in most cases, I followed my uncle's advice, and when someone did something that you felt was really wrong, then have nothing to do with them. Get as far away from them as you possibly can. Probably was a good idea. I got to do enough mischief by myself when I was in high school. Well, Mrs. Sim was a counselor, and when I went into there, I wasn't doing well in chemistry. And she finally said to me, Bobby, I think you're just lazy. And I said, well, better to be lazy than stupid. And then she said, leave. That's a really difficult thing, to get into somebody else's mind. What's important to you? What's important to the child? What's important to somebody else? May not be that important to you. If I was a great tennis player, I'd probably want to get in with the right crowd and playing tennis. Probably the most important thing would be what you were asking the question before. Be sure and not get in with the wrong crowd. The family relationships most important to me are my family primarily. Business relationships were important to me when I was in business, but right now my family would probably be the most important business relationship to me. Most of my friends, unfortunately, at my stage in life, my close friends, have passed away. And so the family and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, after all, I have 4 children, 13 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. So all of those are important to me. My brother, who was very important to me in my early life, he lives in Salt Lake City now. He's 6 years older than me, and he's still going fairly well. He used to comfort me when my mother and father were fighting. He used to help me with some of the things I did at school. He used to help me with some social organizations that I got into, high school fraternities and things like that. How did I meet my spouse? I met her through my best friend, and when I came back from the service, we all 3 went out together, and when I first got back, and then she and I went out together, and we had a whirlwind courtship. I went to Reno and got married. June Peters was the gal that was the best at, she went to St. Joseph's Academy. She helped me very much later in life, because my penmanship isn't great and my spelling isn't great, and we used to have to write reports to some of the companies. I would write out the reports, and then she'd type them, and boy, they think I was smart. Her intelligence, her beauty, and for some reason her affection for me, which maybe mystify everybody, but my advice I would give about falling in love. That would probably be something so personal, I have a difficult time ever answering it. What are the important things to an individual? Do you want a wife that can ride horses, which my wife did? Or do you want a wife that can assist you in what you're doing? Do you want a wife that can raise your children? We can get into a number of things that would attract you to a spouse, but I think that's so personal I couldn't answer it, and I don't think I could give the same answer to the same child each time, depending upon what their outlook was. My philosophy on parenting and discipline is to, first of all, try to be as fair as you can be. Secondly, to be consistent. And thirdly, to say what you mean and mean what you say, and not let things just drift. Now, I was extremely fortunate, because my wife would fight for her children for anything, whenever there was any difficulty. I used to travel a lot, and when I came home, rarely did she ever say to the children, wait till your father gets home, She took care of it. And I think that giving them too much is probably one of the worst things you can do. And this goes back to what I was talking about with Ham and Biddy, with their children. Clarence, the oldest boy, was given practically every opportunity. He was an announcer. He was he set him up in the chicken business, and then he set him up in the feed business. He went broke in all of them, and he provided all the money and provided all the stuff. Paul was the troublemaker, and Paul was an alcoholic when he was in high school. And in fact, actually, they had put parking meters on by Weinstock Lubin's between 11th and 12th on K Street. And when they had these parking meters down there, he didn't like them when they came in. So he took his father's LaSalle and drove over all the parking meters. And so when the policeman came in, he started to try and bribe the policeman. So he had to spend a little time, a couple of nights in jail. Then after Ham died, why, he really broke up pretty. Pat and I drove with him back, and he broke down and cried because he had broken his father's heart so many times. And then the third person that was involved was, of course, Helen, and she became a nun. And as I told you previously, after 10 years, she had a nervous breakdown. So he went back to the Vatican and talked to the Monsignors and the Cardinal, or whatever it was, and paid quite a bit of money to the Catholic Church to have her released from her vows. At any rate, why, he took care of her for all of her life. In addition to all this, because of the money he made, he gave all of the children their homes, complete. The one that Pat had was a very nice home on 37th Street in Sacramento. Brought them their, they bought a 1938 Chrysler. He used to pay the insurance and the taxes on the house and for the children. And he did too much for them. Describe my career path. Of all of the guys that I loved most and was my greatest mentor, I told you, was my uncle, and he was. But he was also very fond of me. And so when I got out of the service, he arranged for me to get a loan at the Bank of America for $3,000, and I bought what was with another guy called the Northern California Chemical Company. No experience, no. As city manager, he was a great politician, but he wasn't a businessman. $3,000 in those days was a year's salary for an average working man. After we got into it for a little while, I could see that it wasn't going to work. We were at it for a year and nearly starved to death. My brother then got me a job with his best friend, was a guy by the name of Don Towns, and he worked for the Carnation Company. So I went in as a trainee for the Carnation Company to be a salesman, but the trainee I went in for, I worked in the fountain, and I dipped ice cream, and I fried hamburgers, and I did all that sort of thing. And then they made me load and unload trucks. And then they promoted me to salesman. I had my own car and to go out and get new business. Now in Sacramento, at that time, there were approximately 12 ice cream companies. Now ice cream was a very profitable item but after the war was over, with everybody gnawing at the same bone, it was pretty tough. But I did reasonably well, added some accounts, but I knew that the thing wasn't going well, and Don, was branch manager, and he was my brother's best friend, and they came down and fired him. But in the meantime, I got an offer from Taylor's Dairy. Warren Taylor was a guy that had started during the war with a milk route, and then finally got into the ice cream business, and he hired a guy by the name of Don Kahn. And Don, we used to have lunch together all the time. And he brought in another guy that later was most important to me by the name of Mike Hickey. He was a great salesman. He drank whiskey first, chased girls second, and sold Alliance products third, and was the best salesman they had. Then the Korean War broke out, and Don was a master sergeant, and they recalled him into the service. So I was the only salesman. He only had one salesman, and so I was the only salesman that was there. Well, Warren expected a lot of what was going on, and this thing was very, very difficult. So Mike Hickey, who worked for Lyons Magnus, told me about a guy by the name of Alan Weber who was working for the Lily Tulip Cup Corporation. So I went to San Francisco and saw Bud Quist, and we hit it off beautifully. That was the beginning of the really where the tough situation got a whole lot better. I had a week of training. Bud was really good with the detail work, and I wasn't, and he really broke me in nicely. Anyway, I had a good basic training. I went back to Sacramento, had the Sacramento territory, and I began to expand. Bud liked me so well, we moved the guy from Oakland, from Stockton and from Fresno, and I then had the Northern California area. The biggest account we had was Zellerback Paper Company, $60,000 a year, and then we had three small ones, Ralph's Distributing Company, Tiedemann and McMoran, and Scottneck Paper Company. Within 3 years, I had them up to $60,000, and the Zellerback Paper Company hadn't lost any business. Nobody had ever used the public business bid policy. We were in the state of California. We were bidding on water cups and various other things. A previous salesman had never done it. Fortunately for me, and this runs into the situation that you would get into about education, the two guys that were my major competitors were Continental Can and Dixie Cup. Dixie Cup by far had the biggest name. Lilly Tulip didn't have the biggest name. Well, they were both graduated from college, and they both thought the world owed them a living. They didn't realize that the important part of sales was work. It was like shooting ducks in a barrel after being in the ice cream industry. Well, after 3 years, the guy that was in charge of our Western operations was a guy by the name of William Raymond Linderking. Mr. Linderking was vice president in charge of the Western operations for Lilly Tulip Cup Corporation. The headquarters was in New York at 122 East 42nd Street, across the street from Grand Central Station. He had been the sales manager and vice president for the entire company. And they wanted to get rid of him, so they moved him out to the West Coast. And they gave him the West Coast operations, and Zellerback was their prime. At one time, Zellerback was their only distributor on the West Coast. But then the law came in, and the law said you can't do that. You can't just sell to one person. And so enthusiastically, Lilly Tulip went after other wholesalers. Well, he drew a line, we used to call it the Iron Curtain. We couldn't talk to New York at all, where many of the decisions were made. It was rather difficult. And there was a shortage, too, of 16-ounce. This is when the 15-cent, 20-cent McDonald's hamburgers were starting, and this was when this time was starting, and it was they began to expand. We couldn't make 16-ounce, 9-ounce, and 6-ounce coffee cups fast enough. The other parts of the business, though, we had plenty of cups, and we were able to sell those. After about 3 years with Mr. Linderking, they finally retired him. And when they retired him, they sent out a guy by the name of Roy Davenport, and he became regional manager for the West Coast operations. And then we were wide open to New York. And I was still in Sacramento, and Roy and his wife came up and visited me. I was surprised, actually, when he first came up. Spent some time with he and his wife, Doris, and then about 4 months later, he called me down to Los Angeles. And he said, Bob, we'd like you to move to Portland, Oregon. I said, what do you want me to go? This is a surprise. I just bought a new house. I said I have 3 bedrooms and 1 bath. I got 4 bedrooms and 2 baths. What have you doing? But I hadn't finished the deal yet, so I got out of it. But at any rate, I said, well, Roy, I got to talk to my wife, and I want to see what she thinks about it. Well, I walked back, and her typical deal was, what did they say? I wanted to move to Portland, Oregon. When do I pack? I'm ready to go. And she was. She was absolutely delighted to get out of Sacramento. She thought it was. And when we moved to Portland, Oregon, then we really had some fun, because we were on the expense account. And when we were up there, we stayed at the best hotels. My mother and aunt were living there in Sacramento, so they took care of the children. I had 3 children at that time. David wasn't yet born. Portland worked out to be a very nice deal for me as well, and besides, Continental Can had all of the Safeway business, and the cottage cheese cups were big in those days. They were paper cottage cheese cups in those days, not plastic like they are today. And we made paper cottage cheese cups, and so did Continental Can. Well, Continental Can kind of had an in at the headquarters, but I got to know Byron Dodds and his wife Gladys and their children, and we got to know each other so well that we spent Christmas and New Year's together. So wrote a letter to his district manager, and in the third page on the fourth paragraph, he said, "Oh, by the way, I think I'm going to change the Lilly Cup Corporation for my cups, and if I don't hear any objection from you, I will go ahead and do that." He waited 2 weeks. He didn't hear any objection. So when Jim Ward came down, who was the district manager, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm changing for like I told you in my letter." "What letter?" He didn't read it. Anyway, I got that, and so they decided then to change the situation and make packaging part of Lilly Cup Corporation for ice cream cups. We had strawberry cups, whole strawberries in the Northwest. We made a special 17-ounce container for that. And so they set up the packaging. So I became packaging manager for the Northwest. And very importantly, at that time, a guy by the name of Hal Johnson replaced me in Portland, Oregon, and I moved to Seattle. The guy that was manager of the general line was a guy by the name of Hob Lorenz, and he was afraid I was going to take his job or something because he did everything he could to try and knock me down. But he was in his 60s, he was worried about it, but I had no interest in his job at all. I was there about approximately 3 years, and we did reasonably well, because I must have done reasonably well, because they then moved me down to San Francisco. And well, actually, we were on Peninsular Avenue in San Mateo, and in San Mateo, we had 2 offices. Now, I replaced my boss that was at that time. His name was Townsend Fugit. I moved into that, and then I used to go down and see Roy Davenport. And you know, when Roy went out to lunch, he would have at least 2 or 3 martinis. House of Lords 7-1. I was talking to the guy that was the head of the vending division, Don Martin, and I said, "You know, I've never seen Roy drunk. I've seen him drink, but I've never seen him drunk." He says, "Have you ever seen him sober?" And probably not. When he went out, boy, he threw around money like nobody I ever saw. He really hit. The guy that followed him, Matt Oliver, said, "I tried to spend that much money on an expense and I couldn't possibly do it." But then he had a heart attack, and they brought another guy in by the name of Lee Mann. And Lee Mann moved me, well, he was the one actually that moved me from Seattle to the Bay Area. Then I got into the politics of the company. By then I'd had about 12 or 13 years in with Lilly Tulip. And I've been doing very well, but the guy that was the vice president of sales was Jack Grady. And he wanted to be president of the company, and the production manager wanted to be president of the company. And so they had a big fight going on. To make a long story short, Jack Grady lost. And so Townsend called me and he says, Jack was not given the presidency, so he resigned. He says, "I'm putting in my resignation, and they're going to eliminate the packaging division and put it all into the general line once again." That's what they wanted to do. So that meant my job would disappear, and I don't know exactly what they would do with me. So I remembered Mike Hickey, who worked for Lyons Magnus, and so I went down to see a guy by the name of Rudy Severin. Rudy was vice president, general sales manager of Lyons Magnus, and I knew a lot about it, and it was an old line company. They actually started in business in 1852 in Columbia, California, not far from where I live. Fundamentally, they sold flavoring for ice cream, and the biggest account that they had there with the guy that was running it, Larry Simon, was foremost. Larry went to work for Lyons Magnus in 1906 and worked for them for 57 continuous years. He was 78 years old when he retired. But fundamentally, the company had some strange policies, and Jack Vorsanger was Leon Vorsanger's son, and so he inherited the job that he was working. Larry was working for Mr. Vorsanger, and they almost went bankrupt 2 or 3 times. One of the times when they were almost bankrupt was when in 1932, and Larry was telling me about that, and things had gotten pretty bad. But they had made cordials and wines before, as well as the flavorings. And when they made they got the distributorship for the Schenley distributorship. And in 1932, when Prohibition went off, they had trucks lined all the way around the building, and the building completely full of booze. And it was a 4-story building. And They sold it, they started at 6 o'clock in the morning and they had all kinds of people. In one day, they got well financially. Then they ran into some difficulty and they got with the Rochester, New York, a firm in Rochester, New York, and Mr. Benham was the guy that was in charge of that. And he was a teetotaler and he wouldn't let them continue with the booze business. That was the biggest mistake that they ever made in their lives. But Lyons, by the time I got there, was getting to be an awfully tired company. They had been in business for well over 100 years. 52, this was about 113 or 14 years when I was there. They had a really intricate sales hiring philosophy. The first interview was 31 questions, and all they did was ask the questions. No comments afterwards. The second one was an in-depth interview, and you had that. The third one was a 4-hour test that you had a multiple choice test. The fifth one was to go to the family and see who wears the pants in the family and make sure everything was okay there. The next was to have a physical examination to make sure you were all right on that. The next was to have a police check on you to see that you had no police record or anything. And then you had the hiring interview. So they went through all this stuff, and then and one of the philosophies of their deal was when you were through with that interview, you would say, "Welcome aboard, Jack. This is your last job." And they hung on to guys that got old and tired, and then Rudy retired, and I became vice president and general manager of Lyons Magnus. But when I was first there, I went down to Arizona, and there was a guy with that. It was Roman Manhart was his name, and he was the guy that was the salesman for the area. I was coming in for the first time. The guy comes out with an old broken down station wagon with a motor in the back of it, and a sports shirt and dirty hands that he'd been working on them. I said, "What's this guy?" And then we went around. He had a fishing buddy with Swift and Company, and he had a few buddies, and he had the same business. But Larry said, "I don't know." Rudy said, "I don't understand why he'll work for so little money." I said, "I understand why he works for so little money. He doesn't do any work." I said, "Larry, Rudy, I could go out on the street, grab the first guy by the arm, and he'd be a better salesman than Roman Manhart." Up to then, they really felt like everybody was a member of the family. And they used to always invite the wives and sometimes the families to the sales meetings. I put a stop to that when I was sales manager, vice president. I wasn't too popular with that thing. And also we had to get rid of some of the guys, which also made it a little difficult as far as Lyons was concerned. Well, I worked for Lyons until Consolidated Foods decided that we weren't returning enough on investment. All of the officers of the company had 5-year contracts. I had a 5-year contract, and we had some stock options for Consolidated Foods, which was the name of the company then, became the Kitchens of Sara Lee. They had 37 operating divisions. One year, Jack couldn't go back to the president's meetings, so he sent me in his place. And there was a guy that was president of Gant Shirts was on one side of me, and beyond him was a guy by the name of Al Tunick. And Al was in charge of Pizza Delight. Now this guy was dressed immaculately, who was with Gant Shirts. And Al Tunick looked like he was a Russian commissar with a suit that didn't quite fit completely well and that sort of thing. And finally the guy that was president of Gant Shirts said, "You know, Al, I went out to the West Coast and I tasted some of your pizza." And he said, "That was the worst pizza I've ever tasted in my life." And he looked him right back in the eye and he said, "Yeah, the pizza was bad, but it was consistently bad." And you know, that's how McDonald's made their. The McDonald's hamburger isn't the greatest one in the world, but you know you're going to get the same thing every time you go in. Then Consolidated Foods decided to sell us off, and they did finally to Earl Schmidtkamp. If you knew Fresno, you knew Earl Schmidtkamp. He ran for congressman at one time, and he had the Wawona Preserving Company in Clovis. So it took quite a while for the sale to go through. And so Earl came down and was telling me how I was going to work. He was about 58 or 59 at the time. He had a son that was about 31 or 2, Bob Schmidtkamp. And we did nothing but have discourses. And I remember one time when he finally left, when I put him on the plane to go, he said, "Now, Bob, we don't want you to get discouraged or anything, you know." And they had set it up so that I was going to go down for an apartment for 6 weeks, or 12 weeks, excuse me. And I said, and they already had a sales manager for Wawona Preserving Company, and it was Bob's buddy in college. There's no place for me. So I called Earl up and I said, Earl, I'm not going with you. I'm going to go into the brokerage business. He said, this is a shock. I said, why is this a shock? We've done nothing but fight for 6 weeks. And so at any rate, I left Lyons Magnus the day they took over. I never took a dime from them. And I went into the brokerage business. We called it BL and Associates. And the first years in the brokerage business were more than difficult. Well, you know, we had 13 salesmen at Lyons, and Pat was used to fairly comfortable. Then suddenly going back to watching every nickel and dime, it was not easy. But we expanded, and I finally got the Robert A. Johnson line of chocolates out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then a few others. And then I began to expand in the brokerage business. And we sold flavoring and packaging then to the bakery and the dairy industries. By that time, things had prospered fairly well with the brokerage business. And we lived in Millbrae, and Pat didn't like Millbrae particularly. I moved to Danville. And in Danville, we had a horse setup so that my wife could ride some horses. But it was we only had about 1.5 acres, and they had to use trails, and it wasn't the greatest thing in the world. And the brokerage business began to expand, and it got better. And then one day I went out and went up on Morgan Territory Road, the top of Morgan Territory Road, and I went back over the hill, and there was 27 acres, and it bordered on the Morgan Territory Land Bank. And the guy had it for sale for around $90,000, and so I offered $80,000 for it, and he took it. So we decided to build a house there, and we did. I got a mobile home that I barely got in there, and I remember the first day I was in the mobile home, I was looking around the place, and I said, "Boy, this has got to be the worst mistake I ever made in my life." Anyway, we did build the house. The Hoagland, the guy that built the house for us, did a good job. She started to breed Arabians, and things were getting better. And so then David, working for the company that he worked for down here, was getting a sales training, and he got a good sales training with the company that he was working for. So he said he wanted to join me. And I thought, oh, what do you want to join me for? You got a good job with a large corporation, and I'm making a living all right. It's fairly comfortable. No, he wanted to join me. So, okay, he joined me, and then we got some offices in beautiful downtown Livermore, and then he wanted to expand the business, and we did, and he took to it pretty well. And we continued to expand, and then finally it got too much for us as far as the ranch was concerned, and so we decided then to move to Black Hawk, and we moved to Black Hawk and lived there 2 years. We got rid of all the horses, the dogs, the chickens, all the stuff that she loved. Anyway, then we moved to Black Hawk. David then stayed with the company, and he ran the company. And actually, when I moved up to Twainhart, why, I would just come down 2 days a week, and David took care of everything else. Then he built a beautiful home in Black Hawk, one of the model homes, in fact. Because it was a model home, they had a big mountain behind it with a waterfall and a hot tub off to the side, and a deck all around, and a barbecue built in. And it was a beautiful place, and it was about 8,000 square feet. And he got it, was repossessed by the bank, and he got a pretty good deal on it. I think at that time it was a lot of money. I think he paid about $1.4 million, $1.5 million for it. As he began to run the company, then I did less and less, and so finally that's when I decided I wanted to move up, and he wanted to get bigger. So then he decided that he wanted to merge with an outfit in Chicago called Guernsey Bell. And so we fought with that deal for a while, and I said, okay, you're running the company, you do it. I don't like it, but if that's what you want to do, go ahead. And it was a stock deal. We owned 46% of the company. And then it was a real Donnybrook. And he moved back there to Chicago. Why anybody wanted to move from California to Chicago, I can't figure out. But and they had a beautiful plant, but they weren't doing well financially. And they needed sales, we had sales. They had a manufacturing plant, we needed a manufacturing plant. So we expanded on that. David got so unhappy with Schickler, who was the president of the company, who had talked us into it, that he quit. But we still own 46% of the company. They owed me money, and they also had a contract with David, so they had to pay him. When we bought it, we got 46%. We got 42% of the company. 6% was owned by the employees. A guy by the name of Dick Dooley, his father had saved the company one time by lending Mr. Horn. The Horn family owned 50.00 whatever it was, but they owned a little more than 50% of the company. The reason they brought in Schickler was because the company had gotten into difficult shape, and he was supposed to be the turnaround artist. So we got into that, and we thought the ideal deal was to have our sales with their production. We would do very well, except that things didn't work out all that well, and they didn't make David president, as I said before. They wanted to make him vice president, so he wouldn't take it, and so he quit, and that made things even worse. And their Chase Bank was financing the company. It was a beautiful company. We had 165 employees, and it was we had 2 acres of land, and it was in the old Chicago stockyards, and we were on 2500 South Morgan Avenue, and it was a shame because we had lovely offices, nice furnishings, and all of this was done through a special loan they got at 3% through Chase Bank. They were beginning to see that there was not much future in this fighting that was going on, and so then on the board of directors we had Schickler and 2 people that he'd chosen, and Mrs. Horn and David and I. So they had the controlling interest of the company. Finally, it got to the point where it got bad enough where they decided they had to sell the company. And so when we decided that, why, Schickler went out to get someone to do it, and finally we got Piper Jaffray. And they came in, and things were so misrepresented by Schickler after Piper Jaffray got in and saw what was going on. I think at that time we got an offer for around $28 million for the plant, but we were up to our eyeballs in debt. And then when they really looked into the books and saw what happened, why, they backed away. But we began to get into bad shape as far as the debt was concerned. Chase National Bank was handling all this debt, and we had 2 $3 million loans, which was a lot in those days. And then we had a number of other things that were from our suppliers and for contracts and various things. It was the financial situation was really quite bad. Well, finally they decided they'd had enough. The Horn family had enough of Schickler. They fired him, made David president of the company. The place was already on the market. And David came in and says, well, with the financial situation we don't have much choice. We got to go ahead with the sale of the company. But we got to see if we can. Well, the guy that was on the board of directors that was representing the Arabs, they came in with a $25 million bid. We went ahead with the deal as far as the sale was concerned. And we did come out with it. David came out with the most money on the deal, not a lot. But I got enough to make it comfortable for me, and we finally sold the company. What lessons have I learned from money growing up? Well, you see, when I grew up, really the Depression began to hit. Herbert Hoover was elected in 1928. It was October of 1929 that the Depression hit. And the bottom of the Depression was probably in 1932 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. And so it was not we were in a solid middle class area where we lived. And it was not unusual at all to see furniture out on the sidewalk where houses had been repossessed. Don't forget, the government wasn't really coming in and putting in low interest rates for loans at that time. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no Social Security, and that lesson that was taught to most of the people that grew up in that area was the thing for you to do is to keep enough money in the bank to take care of yourself for at least 3 or 4 months if you have to look for another job, because in those days it was hard to find another job. And so I think you had a certain reverence for money. And not only that, we grew up in a period with hard money. By hard money, I mean we didn't have much inflation. In fact, we had a little deflation still during the Depression. Whenever you went down to the store, the price of stuff didn't go up. Whenever you went to buy a car, 1936, 1938, the automobiles had been improved, but they didn't raise the prices particularly. When you get some money, what you do with it is you put it away and you invest it and live off the interest or live off the dividends. Don't squander any of the principal. And it comes from a time when we didn't have the backups that the government gives us today. Well, the gift of giving is probably something you have to be extremely careful with, because the guy that bought the house next door to me now is the prosecutor for Monterey County. He's going to be moving down. He's going to retire in Twain Harding, and he's going to hang out his shingle in Sonora. And when he hangs out his shingle, he's going to represent seniors who can't take care of themselves. He says, "Not you." I hope he's right. He says, "I get it all the time in the prosecutor's office of people who have come in and taken advantage of people who are taken advantage of for a charitable cause." Now, there are charitable causes that you donate to. And I won't donate to anybody that calls me up on the phone and wants some money. I don't care what they're called. So what do I support? First of all, I was on the board of directors of Sierra Repertory Theater for 6 years. Sierra Repertory Theater puts on they have two places there, one in East Sonora, one in Columbia. And I support them regularly, and even though I'm not on the board anymore, I still support them. The other thing that I'm involved with is the hospital. And the hospital is the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital, which is Sonora Regional Hospital. I'm on 3 committees now. One, I'm chairman of the Volunteer Resources Committee, which if they have any disputes between any of the volunteers and the committee chairman, they're supposed to submit those things in writing, and we listen to each of them separately, then we make the decision on what will happen. The second thing I'm on is the golf committee. The golf committee puts on a golf tournament each year. This year we made $51,000. And the golf committee supports the Project Hope. Project Hope is a mobile medical unit that we park out a couple of days a week out in front of Walmart. We go to Interfaith. Interfaith is it's a place where people who are indigent can go and get some food or get some wood for their house or get some used clothing, or if they've been sleeping under a bridge, they can get their hair cut and they can get cleaned up to get a job and that sort of thing. And it's supported by all of the churches in the Sonora area. I work on those committees, and the big money really on the committees comes from donations. We charge $150 to play golf, and that includes the golf fee, that includes the cart, that includes box lunch, that includes dinner, and it includes the awards. The other committee I'm on is a project which I do every Thursday, and I am a patient advocate. And a patient advocate is someone who goes in and talks to each of the patients to see what they think of the care they're getting in the hospital. I come in and say, "I'm Bob Lockett, I'm a patient advocate, I'm here to see what you think of the care you're getting in the hospital. Do you have a few moments? I'd like to ask you some questions. If not, I'll leave." Some of them don't want to talk to you, they're too sick. Some of them, and some of them want to talk and talk and talk, and I figure that's what I'm there for. So for that reason, I support them with my effort as well as with some minor financial donations. So those are the 3 things that I support as far as charities are concerned. I consider the hospital almost a charity. One nice thing about it too is, if I go in the hospital, they'll know me. What would an ideal vacation be for me? Well, one of the things that I have to consider is the fact that I feel less comfortable getting away from home now. But the other is the fact that Pat and I traveled, and we've been on every continent except Antarctica. And I've been to London 5 times, and I've seen a lot of China, Australia, New Zealand, and I've traveled. And now I think the more ideal vacation would be like, if I were going to do something, going into Mexico or down to South America and staying at one place where they wait on me hand and foot, and I don't have to do too much, and I don't have a heavy schedule. When you're traveling on some of those things that I used to go on, this Tuesday, so it must be Belgium. You had a schedule you have to meet. You'd have to get out at 8 o'clock in the morning to get on the bus to get to the next place and all that sort of thing. That I don't want to do anymore. But probably an ideal vacation would be go to a deluxe place and stay, and where they would, all the food and everything would be available, and I hope would have congenial people. Our favorite dog was Penelope. Penelope was a German Shepherd. David brought her home. When we lived in Moraga, David brought her home in a shoebox, and she grew to a fairly good-sized dog. And she was a Shepherd and Heinz 57 varieties. And she was kind of the run of the litter, but she was really kind of smart. Now, at this time, my wife had all the children in school or beyond. And Christine was married, and so she had time. And she started training the dog. And when she took the dog to training, and then she worked with the dog. And we used to take her out, and when we were walking, we would go to the Joaquin Moraga camp ground and tell her to stay, and we would walk away. And until we said, come, she'd never break. When I used to walk with her, I never took her on a leash. She never broke. She stayed right there. But it took training, it took time. Pat used to say, give this note to Daddy, give this note to David, and that dog would take the note to the person she mentioned. And we've had a lot of dogs, and we had a lot of them up at the ranch. In her later years, her rear end gave out at the ranch, and we used to have to help her up and down the stairs and things like that. And we were really sorry to lose her, but we had her for 16 years. But we modestly thought that was the smartest dog that we ever saw. She never bit anybody, she was never mean, and she was really well trained. Physical fitness is important to me, and the reason it is important to me is because at my age, it's important for me to keep things going in pretty good shape. To do it, I do walking. I try to keep it on a regimen. I have diabetes, so I've had it for 30 years, and I take a pill for it, and I keep, and exercise is extremely important for me. But I go down to class 5. Class 5 is a physical fitness place, and when I go down there, it's a lot different than it is in this area, because when I go into the place, if there's 15 or 20 people in there, and this is a huge building, that's not unusual. And I also have a 24/7 pass, so that if I want to go in on Sundays or a holiday or whatever the case may be, I can go in. There's been a time or two and I've been in there all by myself. And I never have to wait for a machine. And I usually have a regimen of 30 machines, about 40 exercises I take that take me between 50 minutes and an hour. I try to do that 3 or 4 times a week. But physical fitness, of course, would be extremely important to me at my age. But I got to admit, at my age, my doctor calls me his miracle patient, because he doesn't have very many 87-year-old patients that can still function as well as I do. I could sound egotistical and talk about, they'd like to remember my kindnesses, and they'd like to remember, but you know, there's a lot of people that probably don't have some kindnesses for me, particularly the people I fired. And then I would hope my family would feel I've done a reasonably good job. They've been very, very good for me at this time and at this stage of my life. Why? Sometimes you wonder about your children. As you get older, they become one of the most valuable assets you ever had. And fortunately, all 4 of my children have been reasonably successful. Dreaming the impossible dream, if you remember the song when Richard Kiley used to sing it, dreaming the impossible dream is probably not the thing to do, but to keep your dreams within reasonable bounds. To not, if you're a good golfer, why be satisfied with being a good golfer? Don't just beat yourself to death because you can't be the best golfer. You do the things that you want to do, but try and get goals that are reasonable and reachable. Try to make them within a specific period of time, and don't beat a dead horse. By that I mean, don't try to go after something that is obviously, after a certain period of time, unattainable to you. Move into an area of attainment and try to do the best you can. Religion and spirituality is something, first of all, what I really believe is, if it makes you happy, then do it. Now, my wife grew up in the Catholic Church, and she went K through 12 to Catholic schools. Her grandfather was going to send her to, until she married me instead, grandfather was going to send her to Dominican College in San Rafael, which is a Catholic school. Her family was pretty devoutly Catholic. As the years went by and she looked at some of the things in the churches that were, things that involved with the churches, became much more difficult. I tried to become a Catholic twice, one with Monsignor Lyons when we first got married, and I decided against it, one with Father Casey when we were in. And I told them that I would, I told Monsignor Lyons that we would have the children raised Catholic. My children went primarily, except for David, went to Catholic schools. And I think the Catholic schools in the early stages is good. My wife thought in high school the Catholic schools were terrible. They weren't nearly as good as the public schools, in her opinion. If it makes you happy, do it. But I have trouble with organized religion. I used to like to take the train sometimes from Portland to Seattle when I was traveling, rather than the airplane, particularly when the weather was bad. And I got on one time, and Billy Graham had one of the cars on there, and he was with his entourage. And the rest of the train wasn't very much filled up, but the Reverend was highly regarded, and one of the guys came up and sat with me that was on his entourage. And I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm going into the Olympic Hotel where Billy Graham will go, and I'm going into his hotel room to make sure that someone didn't plant a woman or plant something in there to discredit, because evidently this has happened more than once." And then I went back and listened to them talk. And when I listened to them talk about getting the people at the table to come up and be committed and give me this money and be committed and give me the money, it just didn't set well with me. So with religion, I think there's got to be something beyond this life. There's got to be something out there that this little planet has managed to have the life that we have, and for it to develop the way it has in my lifetime. Just think of the changes that have come in my lifetime and my grandfather's. When I used to talk to Father Oakley, who 1851 to now, horse and buggies, or automobiles hadn't come in for 50 years yet. And it's fantastic. But basically, as far as the religion is concerned, my religion is between me and the Almighty. I don't think I need a church, or I don't need somebody beating on a Bible. On the other hand, I think the principles that were involved in the Constitution of the United States, and the first three words of the Constitution, which determined where the power was supposed to be, "We the people" are the first three words, are based on the teachings of Jesus Christ. And I do believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ. I think they're good, but I think they've been edited through the years. I can't believe that for 1450 years, scribes took the words that were transferred from Hebrew to Latin to English, and nobody edited them, nobody made a mistake. It's hard for me to believe. What do I want for the world at large? Now, that one was one that I talked to about. I want peace, and I would like to see the world get to the point where men can settle their differences without killing each other, which we have today. So I hope that will come someday. It won't come in my lifetime.